I guess I have to explain Dungeon Master. If you guys play Dungeons and Dragons, I handle all of the rolling and imagination that goes with that. I'm also the developer advocate for Truffle and ConsenSys EKAVM. But today I'm here to talk about open source software in general, but like kind of from the perspective of the Truffle team. So I'm going to start off with kind of a story about Truffle's history and how we got to where we are today, and particularly like lessons that we've learned that illustrate why open source software is important. So how many of you guys here are smart contract devs? Okay, not that many. So for those of you who don't know, Truffle is a suite of developer tools that help you compile, test, deploy your smart contract applications. It was the first development environment out there. You could kind of call us the OGs of blockchain. Okay, yes, it's still on. Yeah, OGs in terms of like original gangster. Sometimes I also get original grandpa, but that's completely okay. Grandpas are cool too. But just to kind of give a background of how we started, we were a project within ConsenSys. Essentially, our founder, Tim Coulter, came in and he was told, hey, build dapps. And in that process, he created scripts to help, I guess, make that process a little faster. And the realization was like, or actually, oh, sorry, this keeps like fading in and out. Let me start over. These scripts are actually going to be crucial to growing the blockchain ecosystem. Rather than just building dapps, we should be enabling developers to do so. So in that case, we moved out of ConsenSys in 2019. And what that means is we spun out of ConsenSys, $3 million from them as a sole investor, but we had a 300,000 burn rate per month. And so what does that mean for us as an open source project that's working independently? We need to look for funding. What that looked like was we created integrations for short-term revenue, but obviously that is not sustainable, right? So we started focusing on something like annual recurring value. In this case, a product called Truffle Teams. But as you'll see in the next slide, this was probably the wrong move. Specifically, the shift from focusing on monetizing made us forget the core of who we are and who we serve. So specifically, who we are, a open source software enabling developers to build faster and better, and who we served, again, like I said, those developers just like building in a very nascent ecosystem. And what I mean by that is when you're focusing on that SaaS side of things, we're building a motorcycle for an industry dominated by tricycle riders. Essentially, we're building like really cool software. Truffle Teams was awesome, but it was not what was needed in the industry at the time we were building it. And what this meant was in 2020, we decided, hey, let's reassess, let's roll back into ConsenSys. And I think that was a really great move. So folding back into ConsenSys as a purely open source tool allowed us to prioritize based on developer needs. So rather than focusing, again, on how do we fucking survive, right, we can finally focus on how do we build for the developers. And so kind of learn here from today is that we've concluded that dev tools should not live in silos. Web3 benefits the most when devs get to pick and choose what works best for them. So what do I mean by this? Basically, if you look at the dev tooling landscape, probably the thing that you hear the most often is like hard hat versus Truffle versus Foundry. And I think there is a tendency to have a little tribalism against each source, but we don't view them as competitors because ultimately our view is, you know, however you want to build, use the tool that works best for you. Truffle is not only the Truffle CLI that kind of people grew up and knew with. We have a whole suite of tools. And what we believe is if you want to start with hard hat but use Truffle's tooling like our debugger or our dashboard, we're here to build hard hat compatibility. We are working with them. Ultimately, what I say is we're both competing for free users, so there's no reason there should be any sort of, I guess, bad blood between the two. I'm not going to go over the demos here because we're not a super technical audience. So that's kind of the history of Truffle, why open source is super important to me, and I think why it's super important to the tooling ecosystem and growing Web3. Just to kind of dive into open source in general, I just want to give a few definitions. So open source, I think people just kind of throw around, but there's actually kind of a distinction. So open source is going to be anyone can copy and modify it. It's a free distribution. You might hear something like source available or source open. So that's going to be, you can see the code, but you can't copy it without a commercial license. So that is a little bit more protective. And the last piece of a type of like open source type of code is going to be open core. So if you've heard of that, that's like open sourcing your most core products and then closed sourcing maybe more advanced functionality. And that is to say, source available open core doesn't have a place in the ecosystem. Definitely keeping some code private would be important for like security reasons, I think for larger enterprises. But you know, when you're calling your software open source, do be a little careful how you spin it. What do you call it? Technical Twitter people will get mad at you if you misname what your project is. So when we dive into open source, there are two main types. There's like 80 different licenses, but these are the two that most people actually focus on. So the first piece is permissive. So that's going to be minimal restrictions on usage, typically only require that you pull in a copyright file. This is really interesting because basically you can take it and then make it your own proprietary software. So this is going to be like the MIT license, which Truffle is. I'm not going to tell you to fork Truffle and like, what do you call it, monetize it. But if you want to, we're going to let you do that. That is our MIT license. But anyways, the Apache license, BSD. Copyleft is kind of the second version of that. So it's the same thing. You can take it, you can copy it. It's kind of like a reciprocal process. The requirement there is you have to actually also keep it open source. So that's going to be something like Ethereum, mostly the GPL licenses. So yeah, that's a brief overview of just like if you don't know what open source is, but let's actually talk about why it's so important and like why I'm here today. So why build open source? It's kind of like a no-brainer for developers. Like the first piece I say, enabling to devs to build as fast, as easily as possible. Like a monetized tool to help you build fast is definitely a huge barrier to entry, especially when I'm a student and I have like no money. Thank goodness Truffle is free, right? The second piece, I think, with open source is it provides knowledge as a jumping off point for innovation. So both in software, learning from other people's technologies, improving on that, but also education. So a lot of kind of like educational resources, reference projects. For example, Chainlink has their own blockchain developer hub, has like full-fledged dapps for people to copy and then change and modify and then build faster and better. And the last piece is developers can build according to their own needs. So ultimately, when something is open source and you have a very specific use case, it's great for me as a dev if I say, hey, maybe something doesn't make sense for the core devs to release to everybody, but I can bring this in and modify it for myself to enable me to build my project. The next piece is kind of on my side as an open source, like working on open source tools. I think my friends are always like, wait, how does Truffle make money? And my answer is like, we don't. and that's fine, right? Because I think there is a lot of value for open source projects and businesses as well. So there's the idea of like transparency builds trust. Like we are here to show you what we're doing, and what we're doing is not malicious. The other piece is community contributions means the best idea wins. So this is kind of harkening back to that part where when Truffle was starting to focus on how to monetize, we lost sight of what was important. And the next piece is highly engaged contributors also act as a really great hiring funnel. And the last piece is open code enables opportunities for collaboration. So again, getting back to that piece of when everyone is kind of working collaboratively instead of competitively, that's kind of when we win the tooling space. So I interviewed Richa. She's the co-founder of Push Protocol. I'm not supposed to read things from slides, but I thought this was just like such a sexy quote that she gave. So I'm going to read it out loud. So it's mission, essential to the mission of creating tools that empower users in Web3, allows us to build with transparency, fosters collaboration, and creates a sense of ownership and community. And beyond that, open source gives everyone the right to use tools we build to innovate. So fostering innovation and creativity in this way is how we believe some of the best projects get built. And I completely agree with that, and that's why I decided to read all of it aloud to you. And just to kind of like talk about Ethereum as an open source project, I think that's just kind of one of the best examples of how that breeds innovation. You know, the L1 space is kind of like very competitive. Maybe they're all just forks of Ethereum, not all of them, obviously. But I think obviously what that's allowed us to do is identify the gaps in Ethereum, figure out what we need to do to ultimately grow like scalability and all the things that we need to optimize for to build. I was told not to say onboard the next billion users, but I'm going to say it anyways. I see you. You're getting mad at me. But yeah, okay, so open source is important, but it is hard to build. So it's hard to build in a few ways. So when we talk about contributions, these products are often large and complex. So as someone who's just like coming into the space and saying, hey, I really love Truffle as a project, how do I start? Well, something might require very deep subject matter expertise. I might pick up a ticket and be like, oh, I fixed it, and then you run the test, you're like, oh, I broke 300 tests. I have no idea what I'm doing, right? The other piece is security. I thought this was a really interesting thing that I never really thought about, especially with like open source smart contracts. That requires security code auditing, right? Like smart contracts can lock up a lot of money. That's not something you just want willy-nilly people committing. And the problem with that is smart contract auditing is very expensive and backlogs are insane. Another piece, actually, very common for companies to open source, if not open sourcing their code, is open sourcing their documentation. And one way I think the community members have really rallied around this is internationalization. You know, we're not just an English-oriented ecosystem. But the thing that's, I think, a really hard problem to solve there is like, I don't understand Chinese. I don't really know if like all of the things that you're translating is correct, right? So that's a tough problem too. And I think the last piece is like, why even contribute? I am stressed all the time. Like, I don't have time to contribute to an open source project. Why would do that? So that's another challenge, right? How do you encourage community members to do this kind of out of their own goodwill? Next piece is feedback. I actually made this meme incorrectly. It's supposed to say not all feedback is good feedback, but it says all good feedback is good feedback. What I'm saying right here is oftentimes with feedback and I think opinions, loudest voices try to win. And that's not necessarily what you're building. When you're catering to the loudest voices, you're not necessarily catering to the full community. And along that side as well, when you get a lot of contributions from a large community, there are a lot of diverse and conflicting views. And then that creates a little bit of misalignment with the company vision. That's another challenge in open source. And the last piece, you know, talking to other open source projects is like, money is the worst thing, you know, like it is a free project. How do you get funding? There's things like grants, which are great, but again, it's something that's not like recurring, it's not very sustainable or reliable. There's the ability to find partners, but oftentimes that also comes with serving their interests. And then, like I said, on the Truffle side, we did a lot of integrations. But once that integration is done, who maintains it? That's creating extra work that's distracting from kind of our core value. So I just was like a really sad person just now, but we're actually going to talk about winning strategies. This is a space that can be won, and we will win it together. First part, make contributing easy. So what you should do if you have an open source project is be sure to tag issues as good first issues. So when you have people onboarding into your system, they know like, hey, I want to do something simple. Let me just like filter by good first issues, and they will be there. The other piece is just like making sure you're supporting them along the way. So very clear documentation on how to contribute, as well as instituting clear quality controls. So something that's very common is like automatic security scanning for your repos, and other kind of automated ways of ensuring code that is committed is up to quality and up to security. And the last piece is just like staying in constant communication, like engage with these developers who are, I guess, contributing. They are taking their own free time. If they run into roadblocks along the way, make sure you're always kind of incubating them in your little, what do you call it? Hug of love. The next piece is like encouraging contributions. What are very popular ways to do it? So first off, like metrics-wise with open source contributors, there's this thing called the love score. Basically, like how much does a developer love your product? And this is measured usually through GitHub issues, comments, interactions in Discord, mentions on Twitter. There are a lot of tools out there to help you track that. So something like orbit.love, if you've heard of it. Create rewards and incentive structures. So Truffle offers a Git co-op, which is an on-chain contribution. So basically, when you submit a PR, you get a POAP that says, whoa, you're a Truffle contributor. Chainlink, I know, does tester NFTs, premium swag. Ultimately, like what's really important is making sure that they are part of the community. So highlight those people and elevate them. So something we do is like community calls, finding the builders and saying like, hey, come join us, come like shill your project. We love that you're building. And this is actually a really good kind of advice from Yaz that I got is like connecting your repo at every step of your documentation. It's like a little offensive, but not really. Like discoverability is probably the key point to people interacting with your project. And the last piece, or not the last piece, the other piece of like not all feedback is good feedback. So how do you get the good feedback? The first thing I say is like, developer interviews at any event, especially hackathons, are really great because they're building in a very short time period. And when you want builders to build easily and build fast, they know what problems they are encountering. Along those lines, things like live feedback tends to be better than form feedback. That's not scalable. So ultimately, like form feedback will enable volume. The next part is crowdsourcing issues. So this is really one of the pluses of open source software. People can like put all their GitHub issues, all their bugs and discussions, as well as your Discord. So basically identifying like what's the most upvoted, what issues are the most commented on, what comments are very, very common in our Discord helps you kind of crowdsource that idea of what should we build. And the last piece is making sure that feedback is created in a very constructed and concise manner. So things you guys have probably heard of is like the EIP, something Push has instituted as well as a push improvement protocol. So something to consider if you are building an open source project, giving people a template to make suggestions for improvements. And the last thing I said right here, I can't tell you how to win the funding problem. I have not figured it out. But just to kind of give you an idea of existing models, charging for premium support, hosting services, if you remember from that previous slide, the open core model. So maybe like locking some of your stuff behind the paywall. Open source projects that I've talked to that are mostly successful are still behind VC funding, finding that place where they can actually start to kind of take off on their own. Community funding, I think, is really exciting, especially with Gitcoin now, enabling like normies like me to actually start contributing and like paying monetary value and not like necessarily physical mental labor to making sure an open source project stays alive. And something that I like haven't had time to actually percolate on, but I really want to do, and if anyone's building it, let me know, is a dev tooling DAO. And so what I mean by there is specifically focusing on ways different dev tools can interact with each other to create kind of like a better ecosystem. So like I said, I think like, for example, Foundry has, someone created a project where you could integrate Foundry testing into your hard hat project. Like that's amazing. Like when I get to choose what I want and how to build, ultimately like that's the best developer experience. So the last piece here is like, what can you guys do? This is my battle cry. Like, obviously, contribute, duh. I'm going to say I'm a hypocrite here. I don't really contribute outside of working in an open source software. But if you have the capacity, do it. Otherwise, community funding is also an option. I guess like to give you some clarity into like what an open source project looks like within a greater org. So specifically, let's take like Truffle within ConsenSys, or maybe like I was talking with Chainlink and their educational resources within like the greater, I guess, company, right? Those aren't revenue generating. How do we demonstrate value? And ultimately what that comes down to is the community being loud and proud about the projects you've built, demonstrating that, hey, Truffle as a public good is like critical to Web3 success as a whole. So if you don't dedicate resources to us, the entire industry like hurts from that. So like if you're not like paying or like whatever, like paying or developing, just like spread your love, scream on Twitter, at me. And the last piece is, like I said, I really want to get away from this kind of tribalism mindset. Ultimately, I don't want to have tooling sit in a competition kind of mindset. It's ultimately competition and cooperation creates co-opetition to create the best developer experience possible. So I sped through that. Just want to give a big thanks to the people that kind of helped me formulate this presentation. They're on Twitter. Here's their information and kind of what they do. And that's me. If you want to stay connected, if you're building on Truffle, please let me know. I would love to kind of like, what do you call it? Be loud and proud about you too. I have 2 minutes. I talked really fast. Wow. OK, do we have any questions? OK, if not, I'm going to go catch a flight and leave ETH Denver.